You ever notice how the loudest men in a parking lot are usually the ones with the least to prove? The voice came from a man leaning casually against a gleaming black motorcycle, his grin as sharp as the chrome reflecting the late afternoon sun. Laughter rolled across the cracked asphalt outside Maggie's Roadhouse, a familiar roadside diner sitting just off Interstate 40 in western Oklahoma, where pickup trucks, touring bikes, and weary travelers mixed beneath a sky washed pale blue by the relentless summer heat. The laughter wasn't friendly. It circled one man standing quietly beside an aging silver pickup whose faded paint had surrendered long ago to decades of wind, gravel, and countless American highways. Thomas Walker, 84 years old, rested one weathered hand on a simple wooden cane while the other carefully held a small oak box against his chest. His left pant leg was neatly pinned below the knee, the polished prosthetic beneath catching a sliver of sunlight before disappearing again beneath worn denim. His white hair stirred gently in the dry Oklahoma breeze, but his pale blue eyes remained calm, focused somewhere beyond the motorcycles, beyond the parking lot, beyond the noise itself. Jake Morrison stepped closer, leather vest creaking softly as heavy boots scraped against loose gravel. Around him stood half a dozen fellow bikers, broad-shouldered men who carried themselves with the easy confidence of people accustomed to owning every room or parking lot they entered. One of them nudged another with an elbow and nodded toward Thomas's cane. "Looks like Grandpa picked the wrong place to stop." More laughter followed. Thomas neither answered nor frowned. He simply shifted his weight slightly, careful not to lose balance on the uneven pavement. Silence settled around him like an old friend. That silence somehow irritated Jake more than any argument ever could. "You deaf, old man?" Jake called, waving a hand dramatically. "We're trying to help you smile." Thomas finally looked toward him. His expression held neither fear nor resentment, only the quiet patience of someone who had long ago learned that pride rarely traveled with the loudest voice. "I'm doing just fine," he replied softly. His voice carried the rough texture of age, but remained steady enough to cut cleanly through the laughter. Several customers exiting the diner slowed their steps. A young waitress named Emily Carter paused beside the entrance while balancing an empty tray beneath one arm. Something about the elderly man unsettled her, not because he seemed frightened, but because he didn't. Most people surrounded by strangers looking for amusement would shrink, apologize, or hurry away. Thomas Walker simply stood there, holding the small oak box as though it mattered more than anything else in the world. Jake noticed it too. His eyes drifted toward the box tucked carefully beneath Thomas's arm. It wasn't expensive. No polished brass. No decorative carvings. Just smooth oak darkened by decades of careful hands. "What's in there?" Jake asked with a smirk. "Your lunch." A ripple of chuckles moved through the group again. Thomas instinctively tightened his grip around the box. It was almost invisible, the movement so slight only Emily caught it from across the lot. That single gesture told her more than words ever could. Whatever rested inside wasn't valuable because of money. It was valuable because losing it would mean losing a part of himself. The Oklahoma wind carried the distant rumble of 18-wheelers down the interstate as dust drifted lazily across the lot. Above them, an American flag outside the diner snapped once against its pole before settling again. Thomas glanced toward it for only a heartbeat. His eyes softened with memories no one else could see. Jake mistook the silence for weakness. He smiled wider and reached one slow step closer, never realizing that in less than 20 minutes, every person standing in that parking lot would wish they had paid far closer attention to the quiet old man who never once asked anyone to respect him. Thomas Walker had long ago discovered that silence often revealed more about other people than words ever could. Jake Morrison kept smiling, waiting for irritation, fear, or embarrassment to appear on the old veteran's face, but none of them came. Instead, Thomas simply shifted the small oak box beneath his arm and looked toward the diner entrance where families continued drifting in and out beneath the faded red sign that had welcomed travelers for nearly 40 years. A little boy tugged on his mother's hand, staring curiously at the elderly man with the cane before being gently guided inside. An elderly couple loading leftovers into their sedan slowed for only a moment, exchanging uncertain glances before quietly driving away. No one wanted trouble. Emily Carter remained frozen beside the glass entrance door, pretending to organize menus while keeping one eye on the parking lot. She had worked at Maggie's Roadhouse for 6 years and had become unusually good at reading people. Truck drivers exhausted from overnight hauls, young soldiers traveling home on leave, ranchers stopping for coffee before sunrise, tourists chasing Route 66 nostalgia. Faces rarely lied. The men surrounding Thomas wore amusement across theirs. Thomas wore something else entirely. Peace. It was the kind that could not be practiced. It had to be earned over a lifetime. Jake folded his arms. "You really are something," he said with a laugh. "Most people would have left by now." Thomas nodded once. "Most people probably would." That answer confused Jake more than it challenged him. There was no sarcasm hiding inside it, no attempt to win an argument. It sounded like simple truth. One of the younger bikers circled slowly behind Thomas, studying the old pickup truck parked nearby. Its paint had faded almost to gray beneath years of sun. The rear bumper carried scratches that spoke of thousands of miles traveled across America rather than neglect. Hanging from the rearview mirror inside the cab was a tiny wooden cross that swayed gently whenever the breeze slipped through the cracked driver's side window. "This yours?" the younger biker asked. Thomas gave another small nod. "Been with me a long time. Looks older than I am." "It probably is." Even that answer came without irritation. Emily noticed something else. Thomas never looked directly at the motorcycles, the leather jackets, or the men trying to provoke him. His attention kept drifting back toward the oak box held close against his chest, almost unconsciously checking that it remained secure. Whatever rested inside carried more weight than its size suggested. Jake noticed the same thing. His curiosity slowly replaced his mockery. "You carrying treasure in there?" he asked. Thomas lowered his eyes briefly toward the box before answering. "Memories." Several bikers chuckled. One shrugged dramatically. "That is the saddest thing I have heard all week." Another added, "Must be some expensive memories." Thomas smiled for the first time. It was not a smile of victory or amusement. It was gentle, almost nostalgic, as though he had heard similar remarks decades before from people whose names had long since disappeared into history. "No," he answered quietly. "The important ones are never expensive." Emily felt an unexpected lump rise in her throat. She could not explain why those simple words affected her so deeply. Across the parking lot, the flag lifted again as a stronger gust swept through, carrying with it the scent of hot asphalt and distant rain somewhere beyond the western horizon. Thomas briefly closed his eyes, breathing in the warm air as if recognizing something familiar hidden inside it. For the briefest moment, his thumb brushed softly across the smooth lid of the oak box. The movement was almost invisible, but Emily caught it. It was not the gesture of a frightened man protecting property. It was the gesture of someone touching a promise that had survived longer than youth, longer than strength, perhaps even longer than the friends who had once stood beside him. Jake Morrison tilted his head, studying the old oak box with growing fascination. Whatever calm Thomas Walker carried seemed to revolve around that simple piece of wood. It was too ordinary to be valuable, too carefully protected to be meaningless. Jake took another slow step forward until only a few feet separated them. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, the sound unnaturally loud beneath the heavy Oklahoma sky. Around them, conversation inside the diner faded behind closed windows while engines from passing tractor trailers droned steadily along the interstate. Even the laughter from Jake's friends became quieter, replaced by curiosity. "You know," Jake said with an easy grin, "if something matters that much, people usually want to see it." Thomas gently shook his head. "Some things are not meant for strangers." One of the younger bikers laughed. "That sounds mysterious." Another folded his arms and leaned against a motorcycle. "Come on, Jake. Maybe there is a stack of old baseball cards in there." More laughter followed, but Thomas never reacted. He merely adjusted his grip on the box, careful not to squeeze it too tightly. The wood had become smooth after decades beneath his hands, every edge softened by time rather than craftsmanship. Emily watched from the diner entrance, her concern growing stronger with every passing second. She had seen arguments before. Most burned brightly and disappeared just as quickly. This one felt different. It moved too slowly, almost like an approaching thunderstorm whose first gusts arrived long before the rain. Jake extended one hand toward the box, not aggressively, almost playfully, as though proving a harmless point to his friends. Let us settle the mystery. Thomas calmly took half a step backward. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but deliberate. Please, he said, do not. His voice remained gentle, carrying neither fear nor anger. That single request somehow encouraged Jake more than resistance would have. The grin on his face widened. Now I definitely want to know. Before Thomas could shift again, Jake lightly caught one corner of the oak box with his fingertips. Thomas did not pull back. He simply held on. For one brief second, neither man moved. The afternoon breeze whispered across the parking lot, lifting dust into tiny spirals that danced between parked motorcycles. Emily's heart began beating faster. She stepped off the sidewalk without realizing it. Jake gave the box a quick tug, expecting the old man to surrender it immediately. Thomas held firm, though his cane slipped slightly against the loose gravel. He recovered his balance without complaint. His expression never changed. It belongs with me, he said quietly. I know, Jake replied with a chuckle. That is exactly why I am curious. Another biker reached over with a teasing smile. Help him out, Jake. Together they eased the small box free from Thomas's hands. There was no struggle, only the unmistakable sadness that crossed Thomas's face as his fingers slowly released the polished wood. Emily stopped walking. She saw something she had not seen until that moment. The old veteran was not worried about himself. He was worried about what careless hands might do to memories that could never be replaced. Jake turned the box over once, surprised by how light it felt. This, he laughed. This is what you have been guarding. He carefully lifted the brass latch. The tiny click echoed with startling clarity. Inside rested only 3 objects. A weathered challenge coin worn smooth around the edges. A faded photograph whose colors had nearly disappeared beneath time. And an old cloth patch stitched with an unfamiliar emblem that none of the bikers recognized. Silence replaced every joke. The items looked almost worthless to anyone passing by. Jake frowned, turning the coin over in his hand. That is it, he asked. Just old souvenirs? Thomas looked directly at the coin resting between Jake's fingers, and for the first time since anyone had spoken to him, the warmth disappeared from his pale blue eyes. No, he answered softly. That is everyone I have left. Thomas Walker never reached for the challenge coin. He simply watched it resting in Jake Morrison's hand, and the world around him slowly faded into silence. The laughter, the motorcycles, the smell of gasoline warming beneath the Oklahoma sun, even the steady roar from Interstate 40 seemed to drift farther away until only one sound remained. The steady rhythm of rotor blades echoed somewhere deep inside his memory. His thumb unconsciously brushed the faded photograph still lying inside the open oak box. The brittle edge of the picture grazed his fingertips, and 45 years disappeared as though they had never existed. The heat of the parking lot became heavy jungle humidity. Dry prairie wind transformed into warm air carrying the scent of soaked earth, wet leaves, and aviation fuel. Sunlight filtered through towering trees instead of the clear American sky. Thomas was no longer an elderly man leaning upon a cane. He was 28 years old again, standing beside a Navy helicopter hidden beneath thick green canopy before sunrise. Every movement around him was quiet, practiced, and deliberate. 6 men moved through the dim light without wasted motion, each checking the other's equipment with the calm trust that only years together could create. Nobody spoke loudly. They did not need to. Their confidence lived in nods, brief glances, and familiar routines repeated countless times. The team leader, Commander Daniel Brooks, stepped toward Thomas holding a freshly minted challenge coin between his fingers. It was simple, almost plain, carrying no polished decoration that would impress anyone outside their circle. One side displayed an eagle rising above crashing waves. The other bore an insignia known only to the men standing there. Daniel turned the coin once before placing it firmly into Thomas's palm. Keep this with you, he said quietly. Not because it proves who you are, because it reminds you who you never leave behind. Thomas closed his fingers around the cool metal without answering. He understood. Every man there understood. The coin was never intended to impress strangers. It was a promise carried in a pocket rather than written on paper. Nearby, another teammate laughed softly while adjusting the collar of a younger operator whose nervous smile betrayed that this was his first deployment with the group. Someone passed around a battered metal coffee cup. Another man unfolded a weathered map already softened by rain and years of use. They looked less like legends and more like brothers preparing for another difficult morning together. Daniel reached into his own pocket and removed a cloth patch nearly identical to the one now resting inside Thomas's oak box decades later. He handed it over with the same quiet confidence. "If anything ever happens," he said, "our families will know this patch. Our people will know this patch. We do not forget each other." Thomas nodded once. "Never." The answer was little more than a whisper, but every man nearby heard it. The helicopter crew signaled that departure time had arrived. One by one the men climbed aboard, exchanging brief smiles that needed no explanation. None of them spoke about courage. None of them spoke about sacrifice. They spoke instead about fishing trips they planned after returning home, favorite diners along forgotten highways, birthdays they hoped not to miss, and children waiting back in quiet American neighborhoods. Ordinary conversations between extraordinary men. The memory lingered on Daniel Brooks, smiling beneath the rising dawn, sunlight catching the edge of the same challenge coin before he tapped it gently against Thomas's closed fist. "Some promises," Daniel said, "outlive the men who make them." The jungle dissolved as suddenly as it had appeared. Thomas found himself once again standing beneath the blazing Oklahoma sun, staring silently at the worn challenge coin still turning slowly between Jake Morrison's careless fingers. Jake Morrison stared at the challenge coin without understanding why the room inside his own mind suddenly felt quieter. The dull bronze surface carried scratches that no polishing cloth could ever remove. Along its worn edge rested tiny nicks that looked almost accidental, yet every mark spoke of years spent inside pockets, packs, and whether that ordinary keepsakes never survived. He flipped it over once more, expecting another ordinary emblem. Instead, he frowned. Around the outer rim ran a line of engraved names so small they were nearly impossible to read beneath the afternoon sunlight. 6 names. The final one had been carefully crossed with a single engraved line. Thomas Walker's eyes never left the coin. "Please," he said, almost in a whisper. "Set it back in the box." His voice carried no anger. It carried grief. Jake hesitated for the first time since the encounter had begun. Something about the old man's expression made every joke feel strangely out of place. One of the younger bikers picked up the faded photograph from the open box. Time had nearly erased its colors, but 6 young men still stood shoulder to shoulder beside a Navy helicopter, smiling beneath an impossibly bright morning sky. They looked tired, sunburned, and completely ordinary. No medals covered their uniforms. No dramatic poses. Just 6 friends standing close enough that their shoulders touched. "That you?" the younger biker asked. Thomas nodded once. "All of us." "What happened to the others?" Thomas answered after several long seconds. "Life happened. Time happened. Promises remained." Nobody laughed. Even Jake remained silent. Emily slowly walked across the parking lot until she stood only a few yards away. She did not interrupt. She simply looked down at the cloth patch resting inside the oak box. The stitching had faded almost white, but one detail remained visible. A small embroidered trident surrounded by a simple circular border unlike any military insignia she had ever seen. It looked unofficial, almost handmade. Yet something about it tugged at a memory she could not quite reach. Then she remembered. 2 months earlier, a retired Navy chief had eaten breakfast at the diner every Thursday morning. He had once spoken about old unit patches that never appeared in museums because they belonged only to the men who served together. Emily quietly pulled out her phone. She did not photograph Thomas. She did not photograph the bikers. Instead, she carefully zoomed in on the patch lying inside the box and took a single picture. She opened her contacts and found her older brother, Ethan Carter, who served at Naval Special Warfare Command in Virginia. Her fingers hesitated above the screen before she finally sent the image with only 4 words. "Do you recognize this?" Less than a minute later, her phone vibrated. Ethan had already seen the message. 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared. They returned again. Finally, a single reply arrived. "Where did you find that?" Emily looked back toward Thomas. The old veteran still stood patiently beneath the blazing Oklahoma sun, while Jake remained frozen with the challenge coin resting in his palm. She typed a quick response explaining where she was and that the patch belonged to an elderly man surrounded by strangers. This time the reply arrived in less than 10 seconds. There were only 7 words. Keep him there. I am making calls now. Emily slowly lowered the phone. A cool feeling settled across her shoulders despite the 90-degree afternoon heat. She glanced once more toward the faded photograph inside the oak box. For the first time, she realized she was not looking at forgotten souvenirs. She was looking at the last remaining pieces of a promise that someone, somewhere, had apparently never forgotten. Emily Carter kept her eyes on the parking lot, but every few seconds she glanced back down at her phone. The screen remained dark for less than half a minute before it lit up again. This time it was not a text message. Ethan was calling. She answered immediately and stepped just inside the diner entrance where the sound of passing trucks became slightly muted beneath the hum of the air conditioner. Emily, Ethan said without greeting, his normally relaxed voice carrying an urgency she had never heard before. Tell me exactly what the patch looks like. Emily described every faded stitch she could see. The worn trident, the circular border, the weathered cloth that looked almost gray after decades. Silence followed for several long seconds. She could hear keyboards clicking somewhere on Ethan's end, followed by distant voices speaking across an office. Stay on the line, he finally said. Do not let that gentleman leave if you can help it. Why? Emily asked quietly. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, she heard another voice ask him for the image. A chair rolled backward across a hard floor. Someone said, zoom in. Another replied, that cannot be real. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. Outside, Jake Morrison had finally lowered the challenge coin into his palm, but he had not returned it. His friends were no longer laughing. Even they seemed uncertain about the strange weight hanging over the parking lot. Thomas Walker remained exactly where he had been, one hand resting on his cane, while the afternoon wind gently lifted the edges of his white hair. He never demanded his belongings back. He simply waited with the patience of someone who had spent an entire lifetime understanding that truth often arrived more slowly than judgment. Ethan returned to the phone. His voice had become noticeably calmer, but only because it had turned professional. Emily, listen carefully. I just forwarded your photograph to a senior operations office. They recognized the patch immediately. Emily looked through the glass toward Thomas. Who is he? She whispered. I do not know everything, Ethan admitted. Neither does anyone in my building. But the moment that image appeared, people stopped what they were doing. Before Emily could respond, Ethan interrupted himself. Hold on. The line became muffled again. She heard footsteps moving quickly, then a different voice speaking with unmistakable authority. Where was this taken? Ethan answered with the name of the Oklahoma town. More silence followed before the unfamiliar voice spoke one sentence that made Emily's hands grow cold. Notify Commander Ryan Brooks immediately. She heard no shouting, no panic, only calm efficiency, the kind that belonged to people accustomed to making important decisions without wasting a single word. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the afternoon sun, softening the light that fell across the parking lot. Jake finally looked toward Thomas again. You still have not told me why this little coin matters so much, he said. Thomas smiled faintly, his eyes resting not on Jake, but on the faded photograph still lying inside the open box. Because every promise inside that box was made by men who kept their word, he answered. Emily's phone vibrated once more before she could speak. A new message from Ethan filled the screen with only one sentence. They are already on the way. Commander Ryan Brooks was halfway through a strategic planning session inside Naval Special Warfare Command when a secure tablet was quietly placed beside his chair. He barely glanced at it at first. Meetings like this were interrupted every day by routine reports that could easily wait another hour. Then he noticed the photograph attached to the message. A faded cloth patch. His expression changed instantly. The room continued discussing logistics while Ryan enlarged the image with 2 fingers. The worn trident, the circular border, the distinctive hand stitching along the lower edge. His father had shown him that exact patch only once, nearly 30 years earlier, before carefully placing it back inside an old wooden chest. If you ever see this again, Daniel Brooks had told his son, it means one of my brothers is still out there. Ryan slowly stood. The conversation around the conference table stopped almost immediately. Senior officers watched him with quiet curiosity. He forwarded the image to a secure archive. Within seconds, the database returned a restricted file. Most of the information remained classified, but one line appeared in bold letters across the screen. Survivor status, confirmed. Thomas Walker. Ryan closed his eyes for only a moment. He remembered sitting beside his father's hospital bed years ago as the old commander spoke softly about 6 young men who had promised never to forget one another. 5 names had eventually been marked as gone. Only one remained unknown. His father had never believed Thomas was truly lost. He keeps promises, Daniel had whispered during one of his final conversations. If he is still breathing, he is carrying that coin. Ryan opened another secure channel. Confirm the civilian location, he instructed. Roadhouse Diner outside Fairview, Oklahoma, came the immediate reply. Local witness confirms visual identification. Ryan looked around the conference room. Cancel the remainder of this meeting. No one questioned him. The authority in his voice left no room for discussion. Within moments, aides gathered documents while communication officers began relaying instructions through secure networks. There were no emergency sirens, no raised voices, only efficient movement born from years of disciplined training. A transportation officer stepped into the hallway beside Ryan. Sir, should we coordinate with local law enforcement? Ryan shook his head gently. No, this is not a criminal matter. Then what is it, sir? Ryan paused before answering. It is a promise that has waited more than 4 decades. Hundreds of miles away, the Oklahoma afternoon settled into an uneasy stillness. The parking lot outside Maggie's Roadhouse felt strangely suspended in time. Jake Morrison turned the challenge coin over once, more before carefully lowering it back into the open box. He did not understand why, but handling it no longer felt appropriate. His friends had grown unusually quiet. Even the youngest among them sensed that whatever story surrounded the old veteran reached far beyond anything they had imagined. Thomas Walker remained patient. His eyes drifted toward the distant highway where sunlight shimmered above the pavement in long waves of heat. He checked neither his watch nor his surroundings. He seemed completely unconcerned by the passing minutes, as though he already understood that certain people always arrived exactly when they were supposed to. Emily's phone vibrated again. Ethan's latest message contained only 6 words. Estimated arrival, less than 10 minutes. Emily looked up at Thomas, then toward the highway stretching across the western horizon. Nothing unusual appeared yet. Only ordinary traffic moved beneath the endless Oklahoma sky. But somewhere beyond that horizon, people who had never forgotten an old promise were already closing the distance. The first sign was not flashing lights or blaring sirens. It was silence. The deep, steady rumble of several powerful engines rolled across the Oklahoma prairie long before the vehicles themselves appeared, blending almost naturally with the endless sound of trucks traveling Interstate 40. Thomas Walker lifted his eyes toward the western horizon. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, so small that only Emily Carter noticed it. Jake Morrison turned as well, curiosity replacing the confidence he had worn all afternoon. 3 dark sport utility vehicles emerged from the highway exit and moved steadily toward Maggie's Roadhouse. They did not speed. They did not draw unnecessary attention. Their movements were measured, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The vehicles entered the parking lot one after another before stopping in a perfect line several yards from Thomas's old pickup truck. Their engines fell quiet at nearly the same moment. For several heartbeats, nobody stepped outside. The afternoon breeze swept across the lot, stirring dust around polished tires while the American flag above the diner fluttered once against the bright blue sky. Every conversation inside the restaurant seemed to disappear. Customers drifted toward the windows without understanding why they suddenly felt compelled to watch. Then the driver's door of the lead vehicle opened. Commander Ryan Brooks stepped onto the gravel wearing a simple dark navy polo shirt and khaki tactical pants with no unnecessary display of rank. Behind him, several men exited the remaining vehicles with the same calm precision. None carried themselves like men seeking attention. They spread naturally across the parking lot, quietly observing everything before taking another step. Ryan's eyes found Thomas immediately. For a brief moment, neither man moved. Nearly 50 years separated the young operator Daniel Brooks had once known from the elderly veteran standing beneath the Oklahoma sun, yet recognition arrived instantly. Ryan saw his father's stories standing before him in flesh and bone. Thomas saw familiar eyes. The The same calm blue gaze that had belonged to Daniel decades earlier now looked back at him through his son. Ryan walked forward alone. His team remained several steps behind without being instructed. Jake instinctively stepped aside, still holding the open oak box. Nobody had asked him to move. Somehow it simply felt like the only respectful thing to do. Ryan stopped directly in front of Thomas. His eyes dropped briefly toward the weathered challenge coin resting inside the box before returning to the old veteran's face. Neither man spoke. The breeze whispered softly across the gravel. A meadowlark sang somewhere beyond the parking lot. Then, with slow and unmistakable purpose, Commander Ryan Brooks stood perfectly straight and raised his hand in a crisp military salute. Every member of his team followed immediately. 8 silent salutes appeared across the parking lot at precisely the same instant. No commands were given. None were needed. Thomas remained still for several seconds, his pale blue eyes glistening beneath the afternoon light. Carefully, he shifted his cane beneath one arm and returned the salute with quiet dignity. It was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. It was simply 2 generations honoring the same promise. Ryan lowered his hand first. His voice, when it finally came, was steady but filled with unmistakable emotion. "Mr. Walker," he said softly, "my father asked me to find you if I ever had the chance." Thomas looked toward the familiar face before him and smiled with the warmth of someone greeting family after a lifetime apart. "Daniel always believed promises had a way of finding their own road home," he answered. Around them, the parking lot remained completely silent. Even Jake Morrison understood that he was witnessing something far greater than a chance encounter between strangers. He was watching the return of a promise that had traveled across nearly half a century without ever being forgotten. Jake Morrison lowered his eyes and carefully lifted the challenge coin with both hands, no longer seeing an old piece of bronze, but something that carried a lifetime he could never fully understand. Without a word, he stepped forward and gently placed it back inside the oak box exactly where it had rested before. Next came the faded photograph, then the weathered cloth patch. He closed the lid slowly, making certain the brass latch settled into place without the slightest scrape. When he finally looked up, the confidence that had followed him all afternoon had disappeared. "Mr. Walker," he said quietly, "I should have listened when you asked us not to touch it." Thomas accepted the box with both hands and ran his fingers across its smooth surface as though greeting an old friend. He looked at Jake with the same calm expression he had carried since the beginning. "Thank you for bringing it home," he answered. There was no accusation in his voice, no anger, only simple gratitude. That response seemed to weigh even more heavily on Jake than any harsh words could have. Commander Ryan Brooks watched the exchange without interruption. He understood something many people never did. Respect freely given always carried greater power than respect demanded. Ryan reached into his pocket and carefully removed a small envelope, its edges softened by years of careful storage. "My father left this with me," he said. "He told me that if I ever found Thomas Walker, I was to hand it to him personally." Thomas accepted the envelope with visible surprise. His weathered fingers opened it carefully, revealing a single handwritten note folded into thirds. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting remained unmistakably familiar. Daniel Brooks had written only one sentence. "If this reaches you, then one of us kept the promise long enough for both of us." Thomas closed his eyes for a brief moment. The warm Oklahoma wind stirred the letter gently before he folded it again with extraordinary care and placed it beside the challenge coin inside the oak box. Around them, nobody spoke. Customers stood quietly outside the diner. Truck drivers removed their caps. Emily Carter wiped away a tear before she even realized it had formed. Ryan smiled softly. "My father never stopped believing you were out there." Thomas looked toward the endless highway stretching beneath the afternoon sun. "Neither did I," he replied. Jake hesitated before extending his hand. "Would you let me shake your hand, sir?" Thomas shifted his cane, reached forward, and accepted it. His grip was firm despite his age. "Every man gets the chance to become better than he was yesterday," Thomas said. "The important part is deciding to take it." Jake nodded silently. It was the simplest lesson he had received in his entire life, yet it carried more weight than any speech. Ryan and the other operators stepped back toward their vehicles, but before leaving, every one of them turned once more toward Thomas. Without command or ceremony, they raised one final salute. Thomas returned it with quiet dignity as the afternoon sun settled lower across the Oklahoma sky. When the vehicles finally disappeared onto the highway, the parking lot seemed strangely peaceful again, as though the noise of the world had briefly stepped aside to make room for something far more enduring. Thomas placed the oak box carefully inside his old pickup, smiled once at Emily, tipped his cap toward Jake, and climbed behind the wheel. The aging engine started on the second turn, humming with familiar determination before the truck rolled slowly onto the open road. Long after the dust had settled, no one remembered the motorcycles or the awkward confrontation that had begun the afternoon. They remembered the silence that followed a salute, the promise that refused to fade with time, and one quiet veteran who never needed to remind the world who he had been because the people who truly mattered had never forgotten. Some promises are stronger than memory, because memory belongs to the past, but honor keeps walking beside us for the rest of our lives.